So in this video, we are going to be talking about the Exodus, how God now cultivates his nation. He let them be planted in Egypt and grow into the size of a nation, and now they get to actually go off and become their own nation. Now, although the Israelites came into Egypt as a very prominent group, they were very respected at the time. There has been quite a bit of time, 400 years, since they got there. Now, it might be hard to imagine they'd go from being extremely well respected to becoming slaves, but remember, that's a lot of time. For example, does one president believe the exact same thing as the next president in the United States? Pretty much never, even if they're in the same party. They don't believe all the exact same thing. And the time period from when the beginning of the United States happened to today is much smaller than when the Israelites got into Egypt to when they were slaves at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Also, major changes happened in the land of Egypt. Its rulers, although they kept the title Pharaoh, they've gone through multiple dynasty changes. Depending on when you pick the dates of the Exodus and which scholar you listen to, there have been at least 2 dynasty changes. I think, based off the dates that I look at, about 4 dynasty changes are more likely. Now, how many times do you think if whole dynasty changes have happened? If they're going to like this group over here that's living in the most prominent land in Egypt, and they're growing in a bigger and bigger number, you're going to take action against them. And the action eventually taken over time, they were made into 3rd, 4th class citizens here. Now, the Pharaoh at the beginning of the book of Exodus dislikes the Israelites so much that he takes action to make them into a smaller people group. He actually goes about slaughtering an entire generation of people. Moses, however, is one of the few who survive this slaughter because he ends up being adopted into the house of Pharaoh. He spends 40 years there, but that's taken or summarized down into one sentence in the book of Exodus. And so you go from Moses being adopted into Moses fleeing Exodus within just a couple sentences, or fleeing Egypt within just a couple sentences. And then you actually learn in just a few sentences, Moses gets sent back to Egypt in just a few sentences. So all of this happens in a very short section of verses, even though a lot of the movies that cover this like to spend a lot of time here, and it makes sense, they're building plot. But the plot of the book of Exodus is not Moses' life. It is God saving his people from Egypt as slaves. The plot is really found around a couple verses at the end of Exodus chapter 2, and I'll actually read these. Exodus 2:23 through 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now, if you'd like more details of what happens here, pause the video now and read the next chapter, Exodus chapter 3. It lays out the entire plot for the whole rest of the book, so it's a nice way to read one chapter and get a summary of all of the Exodus. And so that's Exodus chapter 3. Moses is called to go up to be the middleman between God and Pharaoh, and God states that God's going to win the day over the Egyptians. You might know the rest of the story. God goes to battle against the Egyptian gods. Essentially what happens, the plagues actually almost poke fun at what the Egyptians worshipped, because many of the things they worshipped are the things that terrorize the Egyptians over the next time period in those plagues. This happens because the Egyptians don't let their free slave labor go. Now, you might point out, if you read the whole story, that it almost seems like God's a bad guy in some senses, because he hardens Pharaoh's heart during all of this. But pay attention to the story closely. Pharaoh hardens his heart equal number of times that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And actually, God does not harden Pharaoh's heart until you get to plague number 6. And so, God doesn't do anything to Pharaoh's heart that Pharaoh was not already doing to himself. And here are the plagues. First, the Nile is turned into blood. The magicians are able to repeat turning water into blood. I don't know how that helps, since now water's a commodity, but they could do it too. The next plague is frogs. Frogs cover everything for an entire day, and when they die, they don't retreat off to the wilderness again. They die in the land of the Egyptians. The magicians, again, of the house of Pharaoh can repeat this, but whoop-de-doo, there's now more dead frogs. Again, gnats is the next plague. Gnats cover everything. The magicians can actually not repeat this plague, and they admit to Pharaoh that there is divine power at work. The next plague is flies. Flies cover everything in the Egyptian houses, even the food. It does say, however, that God does not afflict the flies to the lands of the Israelites. Their houses are safe. This lasts one day, and Pharaoh actually at the end of this promises to let the Egyptians go, but as long as they don't go very far. But then Pharaoh hardens his heart in the end and doesn't let them go. The next plague is the livestock. All of the livestock are afflicted with a disease and they die. The next plague is boils. Moses actually throws some soot up into the air and it turns into this cloud that spreads over the land, and anyone who touches it gets boils all over their body. The magicians, thankfully, don't attempt to repeat this one, but they do beg Pharaoh for this to end. Actually, that's the later on one, sorry. They do not attempt to repeat this one, though. The next one is hail, and if you haven't ever read this passage before and maybe you're pressed for time, go ahead and read Exodus chapter 9, verses 13 through 35. It's a fairly paradigmatic section, and those set of verses kind of explains how the whole series of every plague goes. So chapter 9, verses 13 through 35 in Exodus is a good spot to go ahead and do that. Now, before this plague, God warns Pharaoh through Moses that the full force of his plagues are coming soon, and Pharaoh needs to relent. God says that he actually already could have wiped out Pharaoh if he felt like it, but he didn't want to. He wanted Egypt to become a stronger nation, to show off his power and set the Israelites just that much more free. The next plague is the locusts. This plague, when it's threatened, this is the one where Pharaoh's officials actually beg him to just let the people go. Pharaoh actually agrees at first, but when he asks who will leave, Moses says everybody, and Pharaoh goes, no, just the men, and Moses says, sorry, here come the locusts. The next plague is darkness. It's darkness that can be felt, is how it's described, and it's total darkness for 3 days. Pharaoh does, at this time, agree to let the Israelites go again, but Moses says, okay, give us some animals to sacrifice. I don't know where they came from since all the livestock died. It might have been Moses poking fun at him, and so Pharaoh says, no, never mind. And so that's when Moses says, okay, there's one more plague coming. But this is when Pharaoh says, I don't ever want to see you again. If you do, you'll die. And Moses says, here comes the next plague, Pharaoh. It's the death of the firstborn. Almost as a side note, before this plague, God tells Moses for the Israelites to go and ask everyone and their neighbors and all of the Egyptians for all of their silver and gold. Give us all of your riches, because they will have a very favorable disposition towards you. At about midnight of that night, God says that he's going to go through the nation and kill every single firstborn in the land except those who practice Passover. Chapter 12 lets us know there was not a single Egyptian household that was not affected. Now this leads us to talk about the Passover, which is a celebration of God sparing the Israelites from this final plague. On the 10th night of the first month of the Jewish year, which is the anniversary of when the Passover, the 10th plague, happened, each household is supposed to select a lamb. Small households may share it with neighboring households if it's too much for them, and they sacrifice it on the 14th day of the month at twilight. They must be 1-year-old lambs. They must not have any defects. And that night they are to wipe their door frames with the blood of the lamb. They're also to eat the cooked lamb, they're to eat bitter herbs, and they're to eat unleavened bread. And although it's at night, you're supposed to eat while you're fully dressed and have your bags packed so you can leave and go at a moment's notice, just like the original Israelites were to have their bags packed. Just as soon as everyone woke up the next morning, they would say, "Get out, Israelites." And so it's all to remember how God saved his people from slavery. When God moves through Egypt killing the firstborn, he promises to skip over the houses of the doors with blood on them. And that's why in Passover, that's how it is practiced there. The night of the plague of the firstborn, Pharaoh actually goes and finds Moses before everything is over and says, "Get out. It's done." Since the Israelites asked for the Egyptians' gold and silver, the Egyptians obey that day when they all wake up, saying, "Just we'll pay you to leave at this point." And so here is where the unleavened bread is explained. It's explained that they didn't have time to wait for bread to rise. They just had to take it quickly and go. Also, one interesting thing to note, I think, is that in chapter 12, verse 38, it says that the Israelites were not the only ones set free. And so it's kind of neat, I think, that it was not simply the Israelites that God brought salvation to, is that there were other people afflicted by the Egyptians that were set free during this time as well. And I don't have time to cover it, but in Exodus chapter 13 and Exodus chapter 14, Pharaoh hardens his heart one last time and chases after the Israelites. The Israelites panic, and then here's my favorite verse. It's Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And the Lord did fight for them. So that's the Exodus. It sets the stage and it sets the tone for how God interacts with the Israelites for the rest of the Old Testament and even further than that. God continually, when he's talking to the Israelites, says that I am the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. It's almost like God saying, I'm the God who saves you. I'm the God who fights for you. I'm the God who conquers other nations on your behalf. God continually reminds the Israelites of this fact over and over and over again as a foundational truth that God is a God who saves his people. It's important that his people remember that that is the type of God that we have. Any questions? Put them in the comments. Thank you.